Wired.com presents The Geek's Guide to the Galaxy. And here is your host, David Barr Kirtley.
Hello, and welcome to episode 269 of Geek's Guide to the Galaxy. Our guest today is John Kessel, who you may remember from our panel on The Man in the High Castle back in episode 179. He's the author of such novels as Good News from Outer Space and Corrupting Dr. Nice, and such short story collections as The Pure Product and The Bomb Plan for Financial Independence. Together with James Patrick Kelly, he's edited anthologies such as Rewired, Kafkaesque, Feeling Very Strange, and The Secret History of Science Fiction. And he also teaches literature and creative writing at North Carolina State University. And we'll be speaking with him today about his new novel, The Moon and the Other. And now, here's our interview with John Kessel. All right, so we're here with John Kessel. Welcome to the show.
Hi, glad to be here, David.
Okay, and so your new book is called The Moon and the Other. So how'd this book come about?
Oh gosh, it took a long time for me to write this book. I was at it for, well, in one way or another, for 20 years. I wrote originally some stories set against the background that forms the background of the book. I first started thinking about this alternate society called the Society of Cousins on the Moon back in the late 90s when my daughter was a little girl, and I was thinking a lot about male versus female. It's funny, I just in the news lately is this memo is written by this Silicon Valley guy talking about how he thinks there are biological differences between male and female brains, and that explains a lot of their differences in aptitude and behavior. In a way, I was thinking along those lines, although I find that memo to be pretty deranged and full of pseudoscience. But I was wondering about this basic question of are there biological differences between men and women? Obviously there are biological differences, but what do they constitute? What constitutes them? How extensive are they? What's the difference between cultural influence and biological influence? I think many things are also culturally determined. So I was just thinking about that. And then I also was wondering about how people might behave in a circumstance where they believed certain things about the difference between men and women, whether or not that was scientifically true. So I imagine this society called the Society of Cousins on the Moon that is dominated by women, and it's organized along certain principles that are intended to diffuse male violence. There are men in the colony who are part of this society, but they have, at least at the beginning of the founding, voluntarily given up certain rights for certain privileges. And so the men of the Society of Cousins are privileged sexually and socially in certain ways, but they have, unless they choose to do a kind of menial and low-grade work, they are deprived of the right to vote. So I thought a lot about how this might work and whether it would be a stable situation. I read a lot about primate behavior. There's a book called Demonic Males. It came out in the 90s by two men, one of whom is I believe an evolutionary biologist at Harvard. And they talk about primate behavior and the source of violence in human cultures, and they ascribe it to male dominance behavior and a number of constellation of other things that the great apes do. And so what the Society of Cousins does is try to diffuse that by various methods.
Well, right. So why don't you tell us about kind of the progression? You mentioned this started out as short stories, right? Could you talk about just the progression of those, how those got published?
Yeah, I do this sometimes with novels. I did it with my time travel novel, Corrupting Dr. Nice, where I figured out a method of time travel or a background. And then I did a couple of short stories that were sort of proof of concept short stories. And so I decided to write some stories set in this background to see whether it would work out for me. And so I wrote a story called The Juniper Tree, which appeared in Science Fiction Age around, I think, 2000 or 2001. And it came out, I thought, pretty well. And then I wrote a long story called Stories for Men, a novella that was really got pretty deeply into this, and it was very well received. It received the James Tiptree Award for science fiction dealing with gender issues in 2002. So by this point, I was already thinking I might have a novel here, and I started fiddling around with it. In 2006, I think wrote the first chapter, but then I stalled and got distracted by other things, and I didn't come back to it until maybe 2011, where I decided if I'm ever going to write this novel, I'm going to have to put my mind to it and write nothing else. So I vowed I would not write another short story until I finished the novel, which was why I published no short stories for 5 years. So it was interesting. I mean, the more I got into it, the more complex it got, the more, in a way, the Society of Cousins and the world it's in is a kind of thought experiment where I don't know whether to what degree I believe the principles behind the society, but I was very interested in thinking about how people might live in this world and what kinds of people. I also feel that people aren't all the same. And so, some people might feel well suited to this social structure, and others might rebel against it very strongly. And then I also thought about the place of the Society of Cousins within the larger culture, which is not organized that way. So in my lunar world of 2148, which is when the novel takes place, there are 27 different separate lunar societies or colonies, and all of them but the Society of Cousins are more along traditional patriarchal lines, or they don't have a female dominance, and they are deeply suspicious of the society, which has tried to separate itself from the rest of the solar system, but still has some economic and scientific and other interactions with the rest of the world. So it made me think one of the principles I thought, or one of the forerunners of this I thought of, was the certain idealistic groups or sects that came to North America from Europe during the colonization of North America. People like the Shakers, Quakers, the Oneida community, which was involved free love. These people were very much out of keeping with the society they were formed in, and were persecuted, and so they moved someplace where they could be far away from others. And that's how I imagine my Society of Cousins starting.
In the afterword, you thank Benjamin Rosenbaum for sort of encouraging you to keep writing these stories. What stage was that at?
That was pretty early. I was at a Sycamore Hill workshop where Ben was, and I really am a great admirer of his work. And he's about one of the most brilliant writers of speculative fiction that I know. And he was fascinated by Stories for Men. He really liked that story. And he said, you should write a novel set in this world. And I said, well, I don't know if I've got a novel's worth of story in me, but he really encouraged me. And actually, the novel that I started writing was going to be set pretty much exclusively outside of the Society of Cousins, showing how the character from Stories for Men, Erno, who was exiled from the society at the end of that novella, makes his way in the world after he has to live in the rest of lunar societies. And Ben urged me to go back to the society and include that in there and have some sort of contrast or conflict between it and the others. And so that was in my mind from what he said about it, although he never saw it after we talked about it in the early aughts.
Because I haven't read the stories. There's two other ones, though, Under the Lunchbox Tree and Sunlight or Rock.
That's right. And actually, Sunlight or Rock was originally the first chapter of The Moon and the Other. But in fact, it ended up not being the first chapter. And the events that occur in that story are referred to in The Moon and the Other in a flashback in chapter 5, which if you've read, you know that Erno has come in his possession an artificial hand that he stole from someone. And the story of how he came to have that and steal it was the plot of Sunlight or Rock. And but it's sort of a minor preparatory story in the novel.
Well, that's kind of interesting because the part in the novel where he steals the hands, I think, is in the libertarian lunar colony, right?
That's right. That's right. Exactly. And in that story, I have it's a longer story than in the flashback. It's considerably longer, and it's also considerably different. I changed a great number of things, but it's set in this libertarian colony, which I have developed considerably for that short story. I was doing my little riff on libertarianism when I wrote that story.
Could you talk a little bit about some of the ideas you developed for how that society runs?
Well, I was imagining, a society where the government is, that government is best, which governs least, and the libertarian idea that everything is an economic, their economic interactions are everywhere, that every interaction between human beings is an economic one, and that the maximizing independence and freedom for the individual is the highest goal of society. In my opinion, I in some ways I agree with libertarians about some things, but mostly I'm terribly skeptical of libertarianism. I feel it's a kind of I feel that it tends to lead then to the accretion of power to oligarchy, what it seems to me to lead to. And so I had some things I played with there. I have a thing called social deviance credit in that story where you can I was thinking about how certain economic thinkers have thought that one way you control pollution is by setting a certain maximum amount of pollution that you allow in society, and then different corporations that pollute can have credits, and they can trade these credits so that if someone's running a coal-fired power plant, they might buy pollution credits from another company that doesn't pollute as much in order to have a more of a leeway to pollute. And so what I have is social deviance credits where you can, if someone else obeys the law, they're not using their social deviance credit. So you can sell that social deviance credit to someone who's a criminal. So they can break a certain number of laws or a certain degree of law with impunity as long as they have accumulated enough social deviance credit in order to make up for that.
Well, I thought it was really funny because in that scene where there's sort of a street altercation going on, and these little flying robots are saying, in all disputes, entrepreneurs must relate to one another with complete transparency. Remain here until a settlement agent arrives. Yes.
Well, that strikes me as one of the beliefs of hardcore capitalists is that a system like this works as long as you have complete transparency, and information is freely flowing, and no one can easily scam someone else. Although I think that's unlikely as well. I used to work before I became a college professor. I was an editor at a commodities wire service, which reported on investments and the transactions in the commodities markets. So I was very interested in that. I learned an awful lot about the Chicago Board of Trade and the New York Mercantile Exchange, Chicago Mercantile Exchange. And I saw capitalism on, in the raw there. That the commodities markets are, at that time and still are, relatively unregulated compared to the stock market, which is not very well regulated either. There's a whole lot of the belief of commodities traders is that the commodities markets are the kind of last bastion of Adam Smith free market capitalism.
Well, because I definitely got the idea that you're not sympathetic to libertarianism, because this mayor colony, they have to have the largest police force to keep things in check. And then they've recently suffered some sort of big economic collapse caused by out of control speculation.
Right. I feel that uncontrolled markets are subject to boom and bust cycles. Certainly, we've seen it historically.
Yeah. I also thought it was really funny because when people are injured, they get taken to the beneficent dividend HMO.
Yeah, I guess you could say. At heart, I take my characters and my stories seriously, but I have this satirical impulse, so I like to play with words like that and to imagine how they might. I don't know if that's credible or not, but it was fun for me to come up with that kind of stuff.
Well, yeah. So there's this mayor libertarian colony you mentioned. There's the Society of Cousins, which we'll talk about more in just a bit. But then there's also this colony called Persepolis. Could you tell us about that?
Right. Well, I wanted to have a colony that was the sort of opponent or a political rival to the Society of Cousins. And I first off figured out that it would the richest colony on the moon would probably be at the lunar South Pole, where they have deposits of ice, and water being a very rare and necessary commodity for human beings, that would offer any colony there the opportunity to prosper. And then I thought, well, I don't want to have it just be a bunch of Americans. I wanted to go for some other kind of culture there that would be very advanced and cosmopolitan, but would not be middle class American. And so I hit upon the idea of Iranian immigrants founding this colony. There are numerous Iranian exiles around the world right now. And there's an area of Los Angeles, I think it's called Tarangeles, because of the number of Iranians who have emigrated there. And so I imagined some of these people founding this colony, and it is essentially it's kind of Europeanized. It's not. I don't mean it to be run by Ayatollahs. It's not like the revolutionary Iran that we know today as a result of the Iranian Revolution, which is a theocracy. It's not a theocracy, although most of the citizens are Muslim. They are ecumenical. They in a way are harking back to period of Iranian culture that many Iranians look back to with great respect. The period under Cyrus, the great king, when they conquered and controlled most of the Middle East. But Cyrus was noted for his open-mindedness toward other religions, so that, for instance, the Jews were in Babylonian captivity. At least the story is that Cyrus freed them, and so this. Persepolis is a kind of utopian Iranian culture, which has its injustices, and it is fundamentally a capitalist society. It has a kind of maybe a social democrat society, but it has a large industry and industrialists who are very rich, and but it's a democracy, but it is also essentially patriarchal. It's a culture that still holds men as having more power than women. And so I wanted a culture that would not easily feel comfortable with the Society of Cousins, which is dominated by women.
Mm-hmm. In the acknowledgments, you thank Fariba Parvizi for sort of advising you on Iran? Yes,
Fariba is a PhD she got her PhD at the University of Tehran, and she lives in Tehran, and she actually wrote a doctoral dissertation on American feminist science fiction. I think our picture of Iran from the United States, thanks to tons of propaganda, is really very impoverished. I think Iran is a fascinating country, and it's more complex than you would get from political debates about Iran, certainly from what the current administration would say about it. So here she is, this woman who's a feminist scholar at the University of Tehran, writing about American feminist science fiction. And I met her. I've never met her in person, but I've corresponded with her because when she was writing her dissertation, she was looking for an American PhD in English scholar who would help her with her committee work there. And she contacted me it was quite a while ago, and I tried to help her out, and I read her dissertation. I helped her. It was written in English, so I helped her with a number of things. And so we got to be friends. And when I was writing, I told her I was writing this book, and would she look at it and help me avoid making terrible, terrible mistakes, which I may yet have made. Anything that's wrong in here is not her fault; it's my fault. But so she did help me to some degree with this, although she, I think, was reticent to leap in there and tell me what I should and shouldn't do too much.
I mean, are there any details that you could think of that you wouldn't have thought of if not for her helping you out?
There is one where in the first one of the main characters who grew up in Persepolis is a woman named Amestris Eskander, who's the daughter of this very wealthy man who runs the water mining company, and she's restive. She's unhappy in her circumstances there, and the first chapter with her, she goes out clubbing. And she's fairly sexually active, and she goes to this club, and in the earliest version of that, she gets involved in basically a temporary marriage, which is something that does occur in Iran. It's mostly to the benefit of men, and I showed that to Fariba, and she felt that was not portrayed very accurately, and it was not it was cartoonish, and so I changed that considerably given what she told me about that.
Because in the book they do have 10-year marriage contracts in Persepolis,
right, and they have. I mean, in current Iran, a person can even have a marriage for like one night. Okay, it's a way sort of take an end run around the religious objections to adultery, and it is legal, but it's really very questionable, and so most of the marriages I imagine in Persepolis are conventional marriages. They're not these sort of legalistic marriages of opportunity, you might call them. But I think that does still happen there, although I don't go deeply into that.
Okay, so let's get back then to the Society of Cousins again, because you do imagine that having this more matriarchal society would result in much, much less crime, right? Is that what you think would happen?
That's right. I have to say that I do think that most violence in human culture goes back to male behavior. And I think that there's got to be a huge biological element to this. I think there's a lot of cultural influence as well. And of course, not all men are violent. So I don't want to characterize all men as being violent, but I do think that most of the violence comes from men. And so, why is that? And there are various theories about that. If you look at one of the things that the book Demonic Males, it's by Richard Wrangham and Dale Peterson, talks about is the difference between chimpanzee social behavior and bonobo social behavior. And bonobos basically they're equally related to human beings, 98% genetically the same, just as chimpanzees are. But their social structure is very different. Chimps are hierarchical, pyramidal structure with an alpha male, and had many characteristics that come from that: infanticide, murder between troops of chimps. The bonobos don't have that, and their societies, their groups, their troops are dominated by females. And the status of the males, there is competition between males, but their status is determined to a great degree by who their mother is and how authoritative that mother is. And the mothers don't really seem to gain status by physical violence, but rather through gaining the acceptance of other females. So there's a kind of you get women on your side, females on your side, and then you dominate by having greater numbers. And that likewise, it seems that they have limited male violence towards females by outnumbering the males, by basically a male. The males are sort of isolated and separated from one another. They're not able to band together. And so a number of these principles I tried to adapt to the Society of Cousins, and try to imagine how it would be. One is that there's a cultural training that goes into raising boys and girls from infancy to channel any violent impulses in socially acceptable ways. So, for instance, sports are a big thing for boys in the Society of Cousins. And young men are praised and famous, and the other thing is men can pursue any enterprise they want if they want to become a scientist or a physician or an artist or a musician. All these things are things that they can do to the limit of the resources that are available to the society, without really having to necessarily be channeled into one or another productive enterprise, although many of them do. I mean, men might want to do all these things, useful things. Most of us want to do something with our lives rather than sit around and watch TV or and so men are deeply integrated into society, and many of them feel perfectly at home in it. But they make an effort to keep men from organizing politically, and to enable them to express whatever impulses they have in socially acceptable ways.
I heard you say that there's a human society in Tibet or something that is sort of similar to this? Yes.
This is, I actually was well into writing this book before I heard about them. They're called the Mosuo. And this is a society where women have traditionally, anyway, they've been sort of corrupted by the Chinese coming in and taking over. And not only that, they're sort of became famous because of this female domination. And they I think are having a hard time maintaining the traditional culture. But traditionally, women own the property. They have a thing called walking marriage, where basically the husband comes to visit the wife but doesn't live with her. Okay, and the men are like shepherds mostly, and the women basically run the domestic household, and they have inheritance goes through the women, and so in some of the characteristics that I put into the Society of Cousins are there among the Mosuo.
That's really interesting, because as the book goes on, so you have the men who aren't allowed to vote, and there's sort of a men's suffrage movement going on,
right?
And it's hard not to think of it as in parallel to like the men's rights movement in contemporary America.
Unfortunately, yeah.
Like, were you researching that or referencing that at all?
I was very worried that people would think I was simply trying to make a men's rights organization argument, because I don't find those people very compatible with my beliefs. So my short answer is no. I didn't want to make a parallel with the men's rights organization. Although I have a group in the story that it's referred to, the Spartans. They are the men's rights guys. Okay, they are the ones who find this society to be a tyranny and want it abolished, and they feel that the natural male impulses are have been repressed and destroyed, and tyranny over boys starts at the moment they're born, and the prejudice against them is huge, and they are very angry about it. I feel that, then there are other men who are, they would like to have the right to vote. The way the vote works is that if you choose to be something like maybe a garbage man, or, working in low level agriculture, like a fruit picker or something like that in the hydroponic place, then you can have the vote. But if you choose to be a doctor or a lawyer or an athlete, you don't have the right to vote. And so there's a kind of social status goes with not being a voter. But there are many men, I think, in the society who feel that this is not fair, and we would like to see the franchise made universal. And so there's a social movement of both men and women who agree with them to extend the franchise to men. And that's what's going on in the Society of Cousins all during this book, is where there's an effort to do that.
Well, right. And so there's sort of two different characters pushing for this, right? There's this guy, Thomas Merton.
Right.
And then there's Hypatia, Camille's daughter.
Right.
Could you talk about those characters?
Yeah. Well, Thomas Merton was one of the main characters of the novella Stories for Men. And he was a kind of charismatic alpha male guy who was his work was just a general. I think he was an agricultural worker, or maybe he worked in a power plant or something like that. But he had a career as stand-up comedian, and I like the idea of a lunar stand-up comedian. You don't see many comedians in lunar stories, and he's sort of like Lenny Bruce, only men's rights organization Lenny Bruce. Okay, really, or basically, if you remember Andrew Dice Clay, he started out as a kind of macho man, anti-feminist comedian, and that's what Thomas Merton is like. He adopts the name, calls himself Tyler Durden, after the character from Chuck Palahniuk's Fight Club. But he gets a following of young men in the story Stories for Men. At the end of that novella, he and Erno are exiled from the society for some things that they've done that have been very destructive. But now in the novel, he's still around, circling through the other lunar societies, and has been continually trying to raise political opposition to the Society of Cousins. He goes around talking about how oppressive it is there, and how he was mistreated, and their revolution was squashed. And he's sort of like, if you think about it, when the U.S. invaded Iraq under President Bush, the second President Bush, there were Iraqi exiles who were going around talking and dealing with the U.S. government and British governments and others, talking about how awful Saddam Hussein was, which I completely agree that he was, and that they were going to, they represented a kind of free Iraq that would be instituted if the U.S. would help them overthrow Saddam Hussein. And that's essentially what he's trying to do. He is trying to get these other lunar societies to help overthrow or otherwise change the regime in the Society of Cousins. And he, with the hope that someone like him, if not him in particular, would then be placed in power there, representing the new democratic Society of Cousins. He's not a character. He's sort of a villainous character, although he's not on stage a whole lot in the Society, in The Moon and the Other. He is there.
Actually, could I just ask you about the Tyler Durden thing? Do you imagine that that character would be well known in the year 2149, or would this be sort of an obscure thing that he plucked out of an old book? This
is a completely obscure thing that he plucked out of an old book that no one ever heard of, and a lot of people don't even know that, and they think it's some other. And they think this might be his real name, or where did he get it from? I don't know, and so it's not like no. Actually, I kind of dislike science fiction books where someone 300 years from now is listening to the Grateful Dead. Okay, it just seems like maybe there's somebody there who's listening to the Grateful Dead, but it's not on the radio. Okay, so that's sort of what I wanted. I wanted this to be a very obscure thing that he resuscitated. You mentioned Hypatia, Camille's daughter. She's a college professor in the Society of Cousins, and she's kind of a social radical who wants to change things, give rights to men. But also, she's a complex character. I meant for her to be, in some ways, admirable, but in other ways, really very much an opportunist who is using this movement, again, as so many people do in political movements, to aggrandize herself and to gain her own influence in the society.
Right. So why don't we, why don't we go through some of these? Who are some of the other major characters in the book?
Okay, so my four main characters are Amestris, who we talked about, the daughter of the industrialist, the water company owner in Persepolis, and then Erno, Pamela's son, who was also in the Stories for Men, but again, you don't need to have read that to read the novel. But Erno was exiled, and he's spent 10 years now. He's exiled at the age of 17, so he's in his late 20s now. He's been kicking around all these colonies. He's been basically like a guest worker or a guy without papers in all these different colonies, doing terrible jobs, doing some sometimes semi-criminal work in order to survive, and he regrets all the things he did that got him exiled from the Society of Cousins. But he's very conflicted. On the one hand, he hated the Society of Cousins while he was there, but now that he's lived elsewhere for 10 years, he thinks, well, it doesn't look as bad as I thought it did. That oppression that men suffer there, because they were male. Out here, people suffer oppression because they're poor, or because their ethnicity is wrong, or their race is wrong, or whatever, their politics or their religion. So he realizes that, maybe he's very conflicted. And then the other two characters so there's the two characters who don't live in the Society of Cousins at the beginning of the book. And then there are two that live within it. And they are Maria, Hannah's daughter, who's a kind of a unusual. Women in the Society of Cousins are encouraged from an early age. They reach their majority. They become citizens at age 14. But they also get kicked out of their family at that point, where in order to keep women from using nepotism to gain power and have to try to reduce the power of individual families, girls get separated from their family when they reach their mid-teens, but they have all the rights of adults at that point, and they're encouraged to make alliances with other girls or other women and marry into another family. These families will have many people in them. It's not just two people in a family. But Mira is not very good she's not very good with her social skills. She's kind of hot-tempered. Her mother abandoned her and her younger brother when she was 14 or 15, and since she was an adult, she was responsible for taking care of her brother at a very early age and wasn't ready for that. And so she has her own grievances against the Society of Cousins. She's now in mid-20s, and she's a postdoc working in physics at the society's materials lab, and so she's a kind of antisocial and she's not a lot of friends, not a lot of women friends. But she's dating this guy who is probably the most popular guy in the whole colony, and his name is Carrie, Ava's son. Carrie, Ava's son. People use the matronymic in the Society of Cousins. And his mother is very influential scientist and also politician who used to be the head of the board of matrons, which is the ruling group of the Society of Cousins. So, and he's also a really superior athlete. He was a martial arts medalist in the last Lunar Olympics. And he's very handsome. He's charismatic. He's funny. Everyone likes him. He sleeps around. Oh, the other thing is, sleeping around is considered to be, it's encouraged for men, because sex is common coin in the Society of Cousins, and sex is unlimited. And as long as you're not violent, you can have as much sex of whatever variety you want, as you can manage. And Carrie is very popular. So for Mira to be dating this guy who's he's so popular that young women have his picture on their walls in their bedrooms, showing him doing martial arts or whatever. And but he has his own grievances, and his main grievance is that, one, is no one takes him seriously, and two, he has a son by a woman he was married to, who is now a teenager. He's in his mid-30s. Carrie's in his mid-30s. His son is 15. And he wants to have some authority over his son, some custody over his son. And in this Society of Cousins, men have no custody over children. They can father children, but in fact, people hardly even keep track of who the father of various children are, because men have no responsibilities, no duties. They're freed of that. But some of them feel unhappy about that. And I guess that's where you could make a comparison to the men's rights movement here in our world. Although I think sometimes they use that argument about fathers' rights as a kind of excuse to be anti-feminist.
Well, right. So people are probably getting the idea. There's just lots of politics in this book, lots of this really, really well thought out, interesting society. And I'm just curious. You say that you showed this as it was in progress to a bunch of this sort of like a dream team of science fiction authors. You got Karen Joy Fowler, Kish Johnson, James Patrick Kelly, and Kim Stanley Robinson, among others. I'm just kind of curious, what did they think of this as you were developing it?
Well, I brought portions of this book as I was writing it to the Sycamore Hill Writers Workshop, which is run by my friend Richard Butner. And at the workshop, many writers had the opportunity to comment on it, and I got some pretty serious critiques over things. There was one year I brought, I think it was some chapter from fairly early in the book, and there was this kind of split between there were women, there were like, 6 or 7 women writers at the workshop. And 2 of the women writers were Molly Gloss and Karen Joy Fowler, whom I've known for 30 years. And then 3 of the writers were younger women writers who are like in their 30s or younger. And there was a real split between their reaction to the chapters I showed. Molly and Karen liked them a lot, and the younger writers had many serious objections, which was very useful to me in going back and trying to see exactly what I was doing. And not only that, seeing how it was coming across. Because when you're dealing with these gender issues, here I am, I'm a 66-year-old white male. Okay. I knew all along when I was writing this that I could get myself into very hot water. And so I wanted to know what sorts of things people would say about it. So I did really want to get feedback from any number of people. And the people you mentioned are all old friends of mine. I mean, those people are all pretty much my generation of science fiction writers. James Patrick Kelly and I've been friends since 1980. So he reads pretty much everything I write. And Karen, is one of my favorite writers in the world. And I admire her more than I can say. And of course, she's an ardent feminist, one of the co-founders of the Tiptree Award. So I definitely was advantaged by having her read the book for me. So she had some comments. They helped me a lot with the female characters because I was trying to do justice to the female characters, but there were things I couldn't know about, or I might easily lose track of, that they helped me with.
Why do you think there was that sort of generational split between the women writers who read the book?
I think that it's sort of like the generational split between the second wave feminists and the third wave feminists. Okay, because some of the third wave feminists don't really like the second wave feminists, and some of the second wave feminists don't like the third wave feminists. And I'm not saying that these writers disliked each other, not at all, but rather their take on things is a little different. So one of the things that the younger writers talked about were issues of intersectionality and really many of the things that we're much more aware of, transgenderism. Actually, I'm worried now because I thought transgenderism was a neutral term, but apparently among some people it's considered to be a derogatory term, and I certainly don't mean it that way. But I had to think about those things because the Society of Cousins is pretty much a binary culture. It's male female. They decide they believe in biological determinism, and that's a problem because they feel that if you're an XY chromosome, you're male, and if you're an XX chromosome, you're female, and that's it. And so someone who is trans, a trans person who is biologically male, has the XY chromosome, but is presents as female and feels that they are female, it makes is a difficult case for the Society of Cousins. They have some trouble dealing with those people, and the way they deal with it is they have perfected what you might call sex changes. They can genetically change your gender, your sex, and so that if you believe you are the opposite gender, then they cost free will gladly change your biology to match your gender perception. But some people don't don't like that. They feel that's too mechanical or biological a perception of gender. And so part of the movement against the structure of the society includes transgendered people. But that part of it is not as gone into as much as I might possibly have done it. I think some of that is a reflection of who I am and what era I came up in. Although I do have one character who is transgendered, who is fairly prominent. Her name is Cleo in the book, but she's not treated very well by Mira, one of my main characters.
I'll just throw in that in the past on the show, we've had people say transgendered, and I've had listeners object to that and say that they would prefer transgender. So I'll just...
Okay. See, thank you for telling me. I'll try to remember that. Transgender. Okay.
But I'm curious because the society, as you mentioned, they treat the idea that there are no biologically based statistical behavioral differences between men and women as a sort of like 20th century fad or early 21st century fad that science has overthrown.
Right.
I'm just curious how people reacted to that idea.
I haven't had too much reaction to that so far, but now that we've talked about it, maybe I will. I have my cousins feel that that there are biological differences between male and female, and they are not. It's not simply cultural. They are not cultural determinists. They believe that there are some things, not all things, but some things are, and again, it's not also for every individual that these things are determined, but rather that as over the population, there are differences. So one of them being the tendency to violence. They feel that is a male, not that women can't be violent, not that women can't, be physically violent, not that women can't be murderers, but that the fact that most murderers are men, they don't think that's simply culturally determined. They think that it is biologically determined.
Mm-hmm. I guess, have you gotten what sort of, I guess the book just came out, so have you heard reactions from readers yet?
I've had, I'm like all writers, I think I'm pretty curious about what people think, and I'm interested in what general readers think. And so, although my wife, Therese, who's also an author, says don't ever read Goodreads, don't go to Goodreads, but I have gone there and read a lot of the comments people made, and it's very interesting to me. So by and large, some people like it a lot more than others. It's interesting the different complaints people have. One complaint is that a lot of people think the book's too complicated. There's so many characters and so much background, and it's got 3 or 4 plots, and some people just feel that it's too slow. But others really buy into it. I think if you get into it, they will. It carries you along. But as regards these issues, there have been numbers of comments. Some people feel that it's very interesting to me how many people feel, the Society of Cousins is a tyranny of women over men, and then others say that it's sort of a imperfect utopia. And that's more what I felt it was, is that it's an imperfect society like our own, has its good points and its bad, its blindnesses, and its things that it sees clearly. So that is interesting to me. I mean, I guess when you put something out there, some people are going to read you, they're going to make assumptions about the author, me, that may not, in my mind, be true, but I can see how they possibly come up with it. When I was writing the book, I was worried about so many of these things. I was thinking a lot about it. And at one point I was sort of clutched out because I felt, oh, geez, I can't write this book. It's too, it's treading in really dangerous areas. And so I sat down and I wrote a bunch of bad reviews of the novel. I basically would just pull quotes from bad reviews. And so there were quotes I wrote that someone could write in a bad review of my book. So one of them was, this is the best science fiction novel. This is 2017's best science fiction novel about the gender issues of 1978. And another one was, the author thinks he's showing us, pushing the outside of the envelope, when actually what he's showing us is a view from between the bars of his mental cage. Okay. So, I guess, I haven't seen those reviews yet, but I suppose that they could be coming.
Well, right. And when you're talking about how complicated the book is, I'll point out that it's a 600-page book. So this is a seriously long book.
It's a Kim Stanley Robinson doorstop.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
But it's 20 years in the making. So if you divide that by 20 years, right, it's not that many. It's not that long.
Yeah, and actually, if you look at the text on the pages, there's a lot of leading, and there's fewer words per page than a lot of books. So the book is actually about 144,000 words long in the final version. So lots of books are that long.
Yeah. In the book jacket, it sort of compares this to Ursula K. Le Guin's The Dispossessed and Margaret Atwood's Handmaid's Tale. What do you think about that comparison?
I am honored to be in the same sentence with those writers. The Dispossessed is a very influential book. I mean, Ursula Le Guin in general, tremendously influential on my way of seeing the world. I mean, I grew up in a world, I was born in 1950. I grew up in a working class, male-dominated culture, and I had to be educated. Still am, I hope, being educated. And one of the people who's educated me is Ursula Le Guin through her writing. And so The Dispossessed was really very important book to me. And in some ways, the book has a little bit of the kind of two cultures in opposition thing that The Dispossessed has there. So I can see how people might draw that comparison. And I'm a big fan of The Handmaid's Tale. It's funny, my wife and I are just now watching the TV series, which is one of the best adaptations of a science fiction book I think I've ever seen. They did it right. It's funny because you and I talked about The Man in the High Castle, the adaptation, the video adaptation. And it seems to me that The Handmaid's Tale did right what the TV series of The Man in the High Castle did wrong, in that The Handmaid's Tale deals with the social differences of this world and the background and the subtleties of everyday behavior and how this change of women being essentially enslaved changes day-to-day life, and how other things are weirdly similar to the way they are today, and it doesn't really get into a lot of hugger-mugger of, a plot and the resistance and the revolution and people plotting and blowing things up and sneaking around and late at night and hidden identities and all that stuff, although there's some of that. Whereas The Man in the High Castle, they just went immediately into the resistance against the evil Nazis and the Japanese, and I think they lost the quality of The Man in the High Castle, the novel, of everyday life in this very altered and strange world.
Yeah, we did a panel on The Handmaid's Tale TV show. I loved it. I think it's just fantastic.
I'm actually, don't tell me, but I've watched 9 of the 10 episodes, so don't tell me how it goes. Yeah.
I'm just curious, could you talk about why you wanted to set the story on the moon and kind of what kind of research you had to do for that? Well,
initially, the moon, I put it on the moon just to get away from the Earth. It's funny, at one point when I was writing it, I thought, I'd probably get more readers if I set this in California. But I'd already set it on the moon, and I like the idea of the idea that people might do social experiments and alter the way they live in settling a place like the moon. And then, the other things I grew up reading, science fiction. There were lots of stories set on the moon when I was a boy. And I also did a lot of research about how you would do it. Building a livable environment on the moon is difficult. And so I wanted to really make that as plausible as I could. The more I got into it, the more I really wanted to understand the complexities of that. Where would you get energy and food and water and oxygen and what are the risks and the advantages of living on the moon? So that to me, I mean, I guess in some ways I think that setting it on the moon also divorces you from earthly considerations and associations. You can see the Society of Cousins a little bit separate, because it's not on the Earth, and Persepolis is not Iran. It's also not the United States, and so I wanted to divorce my societies there in conflict from what we would automatically assume to be the case if it were set in Canada, say. So that's one reason I did it. And then also there's kind of a coolness factor of the moon. One reason I wanted the Society of Cousins is on the far side of the moon. And they deliberately put themselves there so they would not ever have to look at the Earth. So they kind of turning their back on the Earth and its history. They want to create a new history. And they want to divorce themselves from all that went before. I think it's not possible to do that, but that's what they wanted to do.
I mean, in the book, you talk about fusion plants and nanotech and biotech. Is that sort of the level of technology you think we would need before we could settle the moon?
Well, I think we could settle it in a small way without all of that stuff. But I think fusion plants would be, and we don't have perfected fusion plants yet, but there's helium-3 is on the moon, which is one of the fusion reactions that you could do would require that, and so it's a more common resource on the moon than it is on the Earth. So that would be a natural thing to do on the moon. Likewise, what was I going to say here? Oh, I really got into the idea. A lunar environment is going to be closed, and unless you want to keep bringing oxygen or water or other things from the Earth, which is terribly expensive, you have to recycle everything. And so you have to be able to create a closed biosphere in a very small volume to have a lunar colony that lasts. So that's one of the things I really thought a lot about. And that gave me the profession of one of my characters. Erno is supposedly an expert in environmental engineering. So that because it'd be very easy in a closed environment like that for after a while, the CO2 levels might get out of control, or they might have heavy metals in the water, or any number of other things that would make the environment poisonous. And so you'd have to balance this environment continuously. And one of the things I propose is that the Society of Cousins is very good at doing this, but they're the best on the moon at creating self-sustaining closed environments, which gives them an economic advantage over some of the others.
Sounds like you would also have to be underneath a couple meters of regolith.
Oh, yeah, because of radiation. It seems to me any long-term lunar colonies would have to be underground, unless you somehow create an atmosphere for the moon, which some people think can be done. But unless that happens, you really have to protect people from radiation, or they'll suffer serious life effects. Also, the low gravity is a problem on the moon. I didn't really talk about this much in the book, but in my mind anyway, they do genetic. The genes of the people who are born and raised on the moon are altered so that their bone structure is suited to the moon, and they don't end up with calcium leaching out of their bones, and they don't end up with these terrible effects of people who are from Earth who are left in lower microgravity for long periods of time.
You mentioned that you grew up reading a lot of books set on the moon. Are there any, what would you say are some of the best science fiction books on the moon? It's hard to avoid Heinlein.
I read a lot of his stories in the 50s and 60s mostly, but he wrote a bunch of stories about the colonization of the moon, and some of them are really pretty intelligent. And one of the things I have in my book is people in a large domed crater being able to fly. And of course, that's not original to me. Heinlein came up with that idea for his story, The Menace from Earth, back in the 1950s, and he makes it quite plausible. And so I just am really building off of that. I have to honor the man in retrospect. Although his big book that's set on the moon, what's the one? The Moon is a Harsh Mistress.
Yeah.
It's really, I don't like that book. And I would not,
why?
I feel like it oversimplifies the politics immensely, and there's a kind of mechanicalness also to the plot of the book. It's not my favorite Heinlein book. Many people think it's one of his best books, and I do not. At any rate, I thought by that stage Heinlein was becoming kind of a ideological writer, much more than a writer who's exploring things. He was telling us what things ought to be. I hope I'm not too ideological, but who knows?
Well, I mean, you just from reading this book, you are really interested in politics. Have you ever been involved in politics, or how do you follow politics? I
guess I call myself a social democrat, and I'm very interested in politics, probably more than my mental health should. I'm very liberal, and I was a hippie and a left winger and anti-Vietnam War guy in the '60s and '70s, and my politics has stayed relatively the same ever since then. I was, a supporter of women's rights, and I feel I'm a dyed-in-the-wool, bleeding heart liberal. My involvement in politics is mostly, I've worked in the last several presidential elections, the last 20 years. Every presidential election I do volunteer work, and I'm, an inveterate. I used to write letters to congressmen or the newspaper. Now I call a congressman. So I'm, and I've been to many marches. So I don't know that I'm, that knowledgeable. I pay attention. I know history, and I have strong opinions. I try in my fiction anyway, to write fiction, not attract. I don't really want to write. I don't want to write an Ayn Rand novel or a late Heinlein novel, frankly. Early Heinlein I really like. The later stuff, not so much.
Have you ever do you ever talk about politics with more conservative science fiction authors? Do you just kind of avoid that subject?
I do. I have a fairly active Facebook page, and I have a number of conservative friends on Facebook, and I had one very diehard libertarian young man who was a student of mine at NC State, who's graduated now and has sold a science fiction trilogy that's not out yet. He's working on the rewrite. His name is Christopher Rocchio, and he's a very well-intentioned, he's whip smart. He's really very, but he is as libertarian as you can possibly get. And I don't agree with that. And so we've had a few go rounds. Yeah. So I think it's good to at least try to maintain some civil, relations with people whose politics are not the same as yours. But sometimes it's hard.
Yeah. I'm just kind of curious. I have a couple just random questions here. You have one of the characters in the book say, "Physics is full of dead theories, the luminiferous ether, string theory." Is that?
I've always been skeptical about string theory. I don't know it. My math. I got a degree in physics as an undergrad, but I was not the greatest physics student you ever saw. But I know a little science, and there's just something about string theory that seems largely. I don't know. That's just a joke, really. Okay. I can't say that I know any reason why string theory would be wrong, but I'm deeply skeptical.
Well, I think the big knock against string theory is that it's been around for decade after decade without ever making any testable predictions.
There you go. It seems like a mathematical theory. Okay. There's so many things you can do with math they're self-consistent mathematically, but it doesn't mean they represent the real universe.
Yeah, no, I thought that was funny. And then you also have the character Beeson say information wants to be free, and then Maggie's daughter kind of slaps him around.
Yeah.
What do you think about information wants to be free?
I agree with Maggie's daughter on that. I don't think that information has any volition, and that's a libertarian faith that I don't hold.
I mean, there were some science fiction authors who were saying stuff like that, right? But,
yeah.
Sort of.
Yeah, well, I was I'm pretty good friends with Bruce Sterling, and the whole cyberpunk thing that was happening when I was a young author in the 80s, and I was very interested in that, and I learned a lot from reading the cyberpunks, but that. I don't know. I mean, I guess Cory Doctorow, doesn't he think that information wants to be free? I don't know if he does or not. But I just feel it's a kind of glib slogan, and I think information often is it's something that people made up and people control it, and it can be made unfree as well as free.
It's kind of interesting because I read The Moon and the Other, and then I just read all your author's notes in the collected Kessel.
Oh gosh!
And and you mentioned that you had a story. You wrote a story, and then the movie Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind came out, and it seemed to have a suspiciously similar idea to yours. Could you talk about that?
Yeah, that was a story I wrote called Hearts Do Not Night Shine. It came out in Asimov's in like 84, 85. But when the movie came out, I really liked the movie, but I was sitting there in the theater thinking, wow, this is like, really similar to my story. And it's about, my story is about this married couple that's, their marriage has gone sour, and they decide that they're going to get divorced, but then the husband comes to the wife and says, let's get our memories erased instead, and we'll start over again. And so, and then this is a world where you can have your memories selectively erased, not completely, but selectively. So they erase all the memories of the bad things in their marriage, and they get back together again, but their personalities are exactly the same, so they do the same things over again, or similar things, and they end up breaking up in the end. And of course, that's sort of similar to Eternal Sunshine. And the other thing that was really weird is that I had given my Hollywood agent in the late 90s that story, and he was trying to pitch it and to movie people, and he pitched it to a producer around 2000, 2001, and he didn't take it. But then that guy ended up being one of the producers of Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind. And so that was really weird. And so for a while there, my agent and I were, mostly me, he helped me, but I had some lawyers involved, and there was talk about, there were some moves towards a lawsuit. But in the end, I gave up on that. I would have had to put a second mortgage on my house and spent $100,000 against a movie studio with deep pockets. And finally, in the end, I don't think that movie was ripping off at all. Okay, ideas like that are something that people get, and I don't really feel that. I can't remember the screenwriter's name. He's a really wonderful screenwriter. Charlie Kaufman. I don't know if he ever saw my story, but I doubt that he had anything he got from my story.
Well, it's weird because I heard actually that a producer gave him the idea, that a producer said, I want you to write a story about a couple who they erase their memories of each other and so on.
Yeah.
That it wasn't something that he came up with.
Well, I don't know. I actually, it was one of those things where it would have gone on for years, and I would have gotten mentally exhausted and I would have gone financially exhausted. And the world life is too short for that kind of stuff. And, so I let it go.
I mean, there is this thing where Harlan Ellison sued James Cameron over the Terminator. That's the only one that I'm familiar with of actually getting a settlement or something.
Well, Harlan is an obsessive human being more than I am. I'm pretty obsessive, but Harlan, he's like probably got his teeth into Cameron's leg there and wouldn't let go. So.
All right. So I wanted to ask you too, just in the acknowledgments, you say, I must thank my editor, Joe Monti, who, although I thought I was done, generally asked a few questions that ended up making this a much better book. Could you talk about that?
Yeah, I'm very indebted to him. I'd worked on this book for years, and I thought it was really done. And so he bought it. Okay, so I thought it's really done. And then we met, and he said, it starts really slow. And I said, well, yeah, it's a huge book, and, it's got 4 main characters. I got to introduce all these characters. So it takes me a long time before you really get them going here. And he said, you know how many pages it takes before you're done? And I said, I don't know, maybe 80 pages. He says 106 pages. I said, okay. And so he said, he didn't say this in so many words, but he sort of said, what about the first chapter? The first chapter was originally this chapter where it tells how Erno, at the age of 18, comes to steal this mechanical hand and in the Meyer colony. And he said, that takes place 10 years before the rest of the novel begins. Is it necessary? And I said, well, it's absolutely necessary to establish that he has his hand because it's really a major, device and plot point in the novel, and I can't get rid of that first chapter. And then I went home and I thought about it some more, and I thought, well, what would happen? Is there a way to get rid of the first chapter and then still have the information I need in the book? And so I'm not a crazy. I'm pretty good at working with editors. I think I will listen to an editor. Some writers, I think, have a hard time with that. And so I threw out the first chapter and I said, okay, now I've got to fix everything. I've got to make up for that because I can't just throw it out. I've got to do something with it. And so, but then I realized that I could move. I had to have a different first chapter. Chapter 2 wouldn't work as a first chapter. So I had to make chapter 3 the first chapter. And then I had to, and basically it ended up the first 7 or 8 chapters all got shuffled around in a different order. And then I had to rewrite them, and I had to take some of the material that was in the original first chapter and make it into that flashback in chapter 5. And what ended up, however, was that it streamlined the plot immensely. It was like turning a key in a lock, and it got much better. It may seem that there's a lot going on in the early parts of the book, and you have to get up to speed on many things. But in terms of the efficiency with which it presents these things, and the first page of the book is much more interesting than the older first page. It just puts you immediately into the situation and the character in a way that it didn't do that before. So this was all to the good, and I was very glad that he suggested. He didn't tell me I should do that. I had to do this, but he asked questions that made me, and sort of embarrassed me into thinking, well, what can you change?
That's really interesting because, I read the book and then I just, in preparation for this, I was looking over my notes in the early chapters and so on. And I was like, oh, well, this is on the first page and that's going to be important and that's going to be important. Second page, that's going to be important. That it really lays out all the important things in a very systematic way that are going to come back later in the book.
Right. Well, I also rewrote considerably at that point. It went fast. I mean, I met him in October. I sold this book a long time ago. I sold it in October of 15 or September of 15. And then, so in October I met with him and he told this, and I went home on November 1st. I started rewriting and I was done with it by Christmas. It just went really fast.
You said on the Coode Street podcast that you had trouble getting an agent. Could you talk about that?
I did. Yeah. Because, I hadn't had a novel for many years, and you don't really need an agent to sell short stories. And my agent had been a wonderful agent. Many, many people will talk to you about how good an agent he was. His name was Ralph Vichinanza. He had a very large agency, represented any number of big-name authors, George R.R. Martin, Robert Silverberg. And I was on the list there, and he was really a good agent for me. But I hadn't sold a novel since Company Dr. Nice in the late 90s. So I had this novel, and I didn't, when Ralph died suddenly in, I think, 2010. And so I was without an agent. And I didn't look for an agent because I didn't have a novel to sell, so I didn't worry about it. But then I finally finished this book, and in 2000, I finished the first draft at December of 14, and I went looking for an agent in January, and I approached a lot of agents. I approached 26 agents, and of those 26, like probably 10 of them didn't respond, didn't get around to responding to me. And then of the 15 that were left or 16 that were left, only 2 of them offered to represent me. And that was after 7 months. Okay. I was going 7 months with people either not responding or just, saying no. And that was a real blow to my ego. I have to say, I'd been publishing for 30 years, and I thought I had a pretty good book here. And it was not impressing anyone. Now, that was the version before I did this rewrite, so maybe that didn't start as well as it might have. It could have been that. But on the other hand, it made me realize that I think we live in a world now where I guess you could call intellectual science fiction or literary science fiction is not as popular as fantasy is. And this book is complicated, and I'm not saying it's, too smart for anybody. I hope it isn't. But I think that it was not an easy sell. And I think most of these agents said, this is not something, they all told me, the ones who told me, most of them were very apologetic. Okay, they would say, look, this is really good, and obviously you've done a lot of work here, but I don't think I can sell this, or it's a really tough sell, or whatever. And so that was discouraging. But eventually, John Silbersack, who, it's funny, I had met him when he was a young editor for Berkeley Books in 1980, and I hadn't seen him in 30 years. And he signed me on. He was very pleased with the book, and we had a conversation about it after he'd read it, and I could tell he got it. Okay, he really liked it, and so I said, well, do you think he can sell? He says, well, it might be difficult, but he sold it in like 2 months. Okay, and then that also has something to do with Joe Monti at Saga Books, which had just gotten started, and I think Joe was looking to do some different things. He's done a lot of different kinds of books, and he's not unwilling to try things that maybe other publishers are cautious about.
Well, and he's a regular listener of Geek's Guide to the Galaxy, so he's just awesome all around. Okay,
well, yeah, it stands to reason. Das versteht sich, as we say in German.
Well, I was saying this a little bit before we started recording, but this is a fantastic book. It's so well researched and says such good characterization and dialogue, and as we've been talking about, is so politically sophisticated and so thoughtful. And yeah, it's discouraging that you would have trouble getting this kind of book published, because it's exactly what I read science fiction for, is because I'm hoping to find books like this, But so anyway, I'm glad Joe Monti is out there.
Thank you so much, David. Really, I guess you're the reader I wrote it for. I really wanted it to be a good story. I mean, it's all these ideas we've been talking about. It makes it sound like it's a tract, and really it's supposed to be about these 4 characters mostly, and their problems. They each have their individual problems, and they have their strengths and weaknesses. And I'm really deeply into those people, and I wanted the reader to be caught up in their stories. There's not anybody who's like particularly superhero heroic here. They all have flaws, but they also have good points and good motivations. So I really I just wanted to tell a good story.
Well, right, and I'll say for people who might just if it provides any extra incentive for people to read it, without ever losing the complexity of the characters and so on, it does become more of a thriller, sort of a political thriller toward the end.
It does, yeah. It has, as my friend Wilton Barnhart, who also read the book, says, you cannot write this book, John, without having a CGI sequence at the end. Okay, so there's a big CGI scene that when they make the series that they'll have to do, and so I was always aiming for that scene. I knew that was going to be the climax of the book. It's the longest chapter in the book, and I won't tell you what it is, but it involves a lot of stuff happening.
So you think there will be a series of this?
God, I wish it were. I actually thought about it when I was writing it, that this would make a decent, if Amazon wanted to do a couple of seasons of the Society of Cousins or The Moon and the Other, that this would, it's got all these characters, it's got this intrigue, it's got sex, it's got male and female, it's got, super science, it's got, it's got a whole lot of stuff in there. It'd be sort of like, it's not, I wouldn't say Game of Thrones, but you know what I mean? It's got that kind of complexity to it,
Well, right. And it's so interesting. And there are so few science fiction TV shows that are genuinely fresh, and this would be fresh.
Right. Well, I think I only watched the first season of The Expanse, but The Expanse has some of this quality to it where you have all these characters. It has a lot more explosions probably than I have, but nonetheless, there's this future world that's very well thought out. It's complex. There's not just one place. There's a lot of different places working across purposes. I think that's the kind of science fiction I like to read.
Well, yeah. I mean, I've said many times on this show that The Expanse is my favorite show on TV, and I'm always talking it up and trying to get people to watch it.
Okay, so I didn't even know that, David. And so there you go. All right. So, I think The Expanse has that quality. It's clearly produced by people who know science fiction and love it. So your wife has an Amazon series, right? Does that give you a
give you an in any way to?
I've met the head of Amazon programming, but I don't think he knows who I am. Yeah, my wife is Therese Ann Fowler, and she's a noted author. She wrote a novel called Z, a novel of Zelda Fitzgerald, which was a bestseller and has been made into an Amazon series. They're just re-upped for a second season. And so it's funny to have been, I'm just the plus one when I go with Therese we've been to see them filming some things up in New York and also down in Savannah, Georgia. And it's cool, it's just cool to just see how these people work. There's so many people involved in a complicated TV show and so many talented people, and people are generally very nice. It's really kind of interesting. I'm just as I say, I'm the arm candy for Therese, but it's been very interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, no, my girlfriends and I have watched the first 5 or 6 episodes of the Z, Beginning of Everything. We're really enjoying it. I think it's really, really good.
Well, thank you. It's a little bit unusual in that it's a dramatic series that's only 30 minutes instead of an hour. We're so used to an hour-long series, or 40 minutes anyway. So, but I think it's good too. I'm very curious. I want to see them get to, it's about Zelda Fitzgerald and Scott Fitzgerald, those of you who don't know about it. And it starts with the beginning of their relationship, following them into New York in the early 1920s when they're drinking and partying all the time. And Fitzgerald's trying to write his second novel, and Zelda is, very talented, but anyway, it's very interesting. It's more or less from Zelda's point of view. But I want to see him get to Paris. Okay. I want to see him meet Hemingway and, and the Gerald Murphy and all that stuff. So we'll see if they get there.
Well, it's just so funny because he's living in this fancy hotel.
Yeah.
And his editor's telling him, you got to write a short story so you can keep living in this fancy hotel.
Right. Well, that was astonishing to see this, is that he was making up to $5,000 for a short story in the Saturday. $5,000 was a year's wages for most people. Okay. More than most people. It was a lot more than most people made. And so he, this is a huge amount of money, in current dollars, for short stories. And so he could make more money from short stories than novels. Although he made a lot of money from novels too, but it is sort of fascinating to see. The sets they did for that hotel sequence are just astonishing. They really Amazon. I mean, whatever you think about Amazon, I know there are ups and downs to it, but they really have invested money in their video production. They're not going second rate.
Yeah, no, like I said, it's a terrific show. So it's called Z, the Beginning of Everything, if people want to check it out.
And Therese has a new book just finished called, well, right now it's the title's up in the air, but right now it's called Scenes of Her Own Making. It's about Alva Vanderbilt, who was a woman who married into the Vanderbilt family in the 1870s, and it follows her life. It's got it's sort of like Downton Abbey in the United States during the Gilded Age, with industrialists and high society, the 400. It's really pretty interesting.
Okay, so before we run out of time here, I did also want to ask you, one thing that's come up on the show a couple times is just how science fiction writers, what sort of experience science fiction writers have in creative writing programs. Mm-hmm. And I know that you teach creative writing. Do you have, what do you think is sort of the current state of science fiction writers trying to write science fiction in creative writing classes?
I think that current, if you think about MFA programs, Master of Fine Arts programs in creative writing, there is more willingness to see what you broadly call speculative fiction in such programs, weird fiction that doesn't follow ordinary, mundane reality. But if you're trying to do genre science fiction and fantasy, I think it's still very rare to find a program that is very comfortable with it. But our program at NC State University has been, I think, pretty much because I'm there, and I'm not the only fiction writer on the faculty. My two main colleagues are Wilton Barnhart, author of a wonderful novel called Look Away, Look Away, a couple years ago, and another one called Gospel. And then Belle Boggs. And they're okay with genre fiction. We've been getting a steady application of people every year who are genre writers or want to be genre writers. Some of them already well established who just want to get the MFA. So, for instance, Kiz Johnson was a student here and got her MFA here. Recently, just this spring, Alyssa Wong completed her MFA here. Others are not maybe as well known yet, but I think they're going to be. One of the recent graduates was Cadwell Turnbull, who just had a story in the 40th anniversary Asimov's. Really wonderful story. A young woman named Diana Fenves wrote a novel with me that is called The Translators, and I think it's a wonderful comic space opera. I hope it gets published. It's on. She has an agent and is on submission. So we've been getting science fiction and fantasy writers coming through our program. Oh, Helena Bell was one of our writers. Julie Steinbacher. These are all really very talented young writers.
Andy Duncan, right?
Andy Duncan was a student of mine back in the 90s. So Andy is not a kid anymore, but yeah, he was great to work with. I very much enjoyed having Andy as a student. He's not a student anymore. So, one of the things, however, that's coming up is that I am now in phased retirement, which means that I'm teaching only half time. And eventually I will be no longer regular faculty at NC State. So we're hoping to still maintain this genre fiction or at least openness to speculative fiction in the program. But to some degree, it'll depend on who they hire to replace me when that comes about.
All right, so we're pretty much out of time. So, John, do you have any just final thoughts or any other projects you want to mention or anything?
Put a word in for my new book. Since I've sort of cut back on the teaching, I'm writing more. And so I've got another novel completed. It's going to come out in February of next year, February of 18. It's called Pride and Prometheus. It's an expansion of a novelette I wrote that won the Nebula Award. It's a story that in some ways combines Frankenstein and Pride and Prejudice. Well, it's not a joke story. It's pretty serious. But it's the main character is Mary Bennett from Pride and Prejudice, the middle sister of the Bennett sisters, and then she meets Victor Frankenstein and ultimately Frankenstein's monster, his creature, and things ensue. I'm very happy with it. Actually, I think it's a pretty cool book. It's so different from The Moon and the Other. It's just you're going to have to switch gears to get into it. But as I say, it will be out in February of next year.
That sounds great. I'll also just mention that there is this book, The Collected Kessel, that's up on Amazon as an ebook. It's just $6 or something for 700 pages or so of short stories. So, and author's notes too. So people should check that out as well.
It's good.
Okay, great. So I think we'll wrap things up there. So we've been speaking with John Kessel about his new book, The Moon and the Other. So John, thank you so much for joining us.
David, thanks so much I've really enjoyed talking with you.
And that was our interview. So big thanks again to John Kessel for joining us on the show. Big thanks as well to Scotch62, who just gave us 5 stars on iTunes, and who writes that Geek's Guide to the Galaxy is, quote, just what I need to take me out of the current state of affairs. So big thanks again to Scotch62 for that great review. Special thanks as well to Scott Wilcox, who just signed up this week to support us on Patreon. Geek's Guide to the Galaxy is made possible thanks to support from listeners like you. So if you enjoy the show and want it to continue, please sign up to give us $1 or $2 per episode over at patreon.com/geeks. And if you'd rather make a one-time contribution, you can do that via check or PayPal over at geeksguideshow.com/crowdfunding. So big thanks again to everyone who's contributed. We really appreciate it. All right, so that was our show. So thanks everyone for listening, and we'll see you next time.
The Geek's Guide to the Galaxy is a production of Wired.com. For more information about the show, visit geeksguideshow.com. To learn more about your host, visit davidbarrkirtley.com. Music and voiceover produced by yours truly, Jack Kincaid. If you enjoyed this program, tell your friends. If you didn't enjoy it, tell no one. Thank you for listening.